So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome again to GSI Teaching Orientation. This is the snowiest one that I've ever been to. My name is Laura Schram, and I am one of the assistant directors at CRLT. My talk today is on classroom communication, which is designed first to help you think about useful pedagogical strategies to facilitate communication in two senses. You to your students, but also your students back to you. Second, I'd like to help you think about strategies for supporting learning across student differences in your classrooms. And lastly, I hope that this talk will give you some good strategies to use in practice teaching, which is coming up next. Feel free to take notes on the handout in your plenary packet. There's a two-sided handout entitled Classroom Communication that is provided on the right-hand side of your folder for you to follow along and take notes. So today, we are going to consider communicating across differences in three ways. First, I'm going to talk about what some student differences are. Next, I'll talk about the implications that these differences have for teaching. And lastly, I'll provide some communication strategies for reaching all students. So what are some of the student differences? Some of you, like myself, might have done your undergraduate study at a very different type of place than the University of Michigan, whether that was at a liberal arts college or even outside of the US. To get a sense of the student body population here at the University of Michigan, I'd like to ask you to take out your blue GSI guidebooks and take a look at the student profile data on pages 2 and 3 of the GSI guidebook. So I'll give people a minute to kind of get that out and give you a little bit more instruction. So I see most people have their guidebooks out. What I'd like you to do is review the data on these 2 pages and identify 1 or 2 things that are particularly interesting, surprising, or relevant to you for your teaching, and share that with a neighbor. So I'll give you 2 or 3 minutes to have table conversations and let you look at that data. So I hope you all were able to have some interesting, kind of very brief discussion at your tables. If I had to guess, some of you might have been commenting on the academic preparation data or the students' expectations about academics, and so I've replicated some of that here. As the first column here demonstrates, U of M students believe that they're pretty smart in comparison to the average person their age, and they're used to doing well in school, and they have a long history of academic success. But for many students with this view of themselves, the actual academic expectations or workload at U of M can be quite shocking and be a big transition, especially if they're just transitioning from high school, so if you're in an intro level class. So we can see suggestions of that when we look a little bit more at the specific academic self-assessments, which I've also replicated here. You can see that in terms of math, about 65% consider themselves above average, whereas in terms of writing, only 54% consider themselves above average. And the accepted wisdom that you might have heard that all students expect to receive an A actually is not correct with at least their self-reports on survey data. This survey indicates that about a quarter of the students don't even expect to make a B average. So in any class that you teach, particularly an introductory level course, you'll have students with a wide range of academic preparation. And I want to emphasize that for those of you who are teaching graduate students, this is also the case that there's quite a variation in skill level. For example, in the social sciences, some students might have a lot of statistics background, whereas others may have little or none. In some of the professional schools like public health or SNRE, students will come from a wide range of disciplinary backgrounds, some of which might have many courses in the natural sciences, or some may have very few. So as you can see from the student data, there's lots of other differences as well. And the data that you've been provided here certainly doesn't capture all of the differences. There'll be differences in religion, differences in path to U of M. Some will come straight from high school, but others will transfer from community college or come from military service. So the point that I want to make here is that for some, U of M will be the most diverse place that they've experienced yet, and for them, their attendance will give them an opportunity to live and study with students from backgrounds that they've never encountered before. But I want to maybe delve a little bit deeper into thinking about this through the lens of racial diversity. So this is some data that's replicated on your handout because it's kind of hard to see here. What I'd like you to do is take a look at your handout here. This is data gathered from the fall 2012 entering student cohort, and it shows the racial composition of neighborhoods where students grow up. I'll give you maybe 30 seconds to look at the handout to kind of understand what the data is illustrating. So I hear a little bit of table conversation. What maybe you've been talking about at your tables is that overall this data suggests that students of color have had a lot more experience in cross-racial settings than have most white students. For example, if you combine the mostly white and completely white categories, over 90% of the self-identified white students here at U of M grew up in predominantly white neighborhoods. So for them, U of M provides an environment where they encounter students from backgrounds that maybe they've never encountered before. In contrast, about a third of the African American students, more than half of the Asian American students, and about 60% of Latino students also report having grown up in predominantly white neighborhoods. But if you take a look at the completely non-white and the mostly non-white data clusters, many of U of M students of color come from neighborhoods that include a substantial proportion of people of color. And it's important to keep in mind that for these students, the campus may not always feel like a welcoming place. You might wonder, what is the educational significance of racial and ethnic diversity of our student body? I want to mention some research that's been conducted by U of M psychology professor emerita Patricia Gurin, which showed significant benefits. She used data that tracked changes in students during their 4 years at Michigan. The link to her research is included on your handout under the heading Educational Impact of Racial and Ethnic Diversity if you're interested in this subject and want to read more. But I'll kind of share a little bit the takeaways of her research. She examined how students were affected by their experiences with diversity both in and outside of the classroom, and she found that those with the most experience with diversity first experienced increases in learning and motivation. So for example, these students are more likely to analyze reasons for behavior, to seek out complex explanations, to think about the influence of society on people, and to aspire to postgraduate degrees. Second, she also found that these students showed greater increases in engaged citizenship. They were more likely to place importance on personally influencing the political structure. Third, they also had increased chances of seeking out racial diversity in the future, in their friendships, in their workplaces, and in their neighborhoods. It's important to note, and interesting if you'd like to read more, that many of these benefits depended on the quality of the interactions that the students experienced. Patricia Gurin has also done more research on how to promote intergroup dialogue, which I know one of our GSI panelists mentioned earlier. So that's a resource, our IGR office, if you're interested in learning more. But the takeaway of her research is that while assembling a diverse group of people is necessary, it's not sufficient for quality interaction. Interaction across differences doesn't always happen naturally, whether that's in the classroom or the residence hall. So interactions need to be encouraged and effort taken to ensure that those interactions will be positive. So a crucial takeaway point of her research is that instructors can play a key role in facilitating those positive interactions and taking advantage of the diverse environment here at U of M. So in the classroom, you can help to bridge student differences so that they maximally gain from their interactions with each other and with the course material. This involves two things. First, it involves planning for students to interact with each other. And for those of you who were here earlier, I know Claire mentioned this as a strategy, but actually planning for students to gain experience working successfully with diverse individuals. Second, you can also help students to constructively discuss diversity issues using the disciplinary tools at your disposal. So how might you do this in terms of concrete examples, given the range of disciplines that's represented in this room? If you plan to use groups, many instructors use data gathered from their students on a variety of variables and use that information to assign either lab or other teamwork groups with a deliberate mix of students that are majors or not, in-state native Michiganders or not, native English speakers are some possible areas that you might want to consider. And they prescribe roles such as note taker, report writer, and presenter. So creating an intentional mix in group work. And second, in some classes, the topics might provide some natural connections, like in the linguistics class where the instructor prepared students for discussions of migration and identity by having students reflect in writing and then sharing in class their own family's experiences with language and identity. Another way to conceptualize student differences is to think about the ways that students might prefer to process information. To help us think about this, I have a little activity for you. So I'm going to explain some multiple choice activities that are drawn from the VARC inventory. But first, let me explain what that is. VARC stands for visual, auditory, reading, writing, and kinesthetic, or hands-on. VARC is one of a number of learning inventories that's available. What I'm going to do is read you 2 questions and ask you to think about them, and then stand up, if you're able, for the one choice or choices that you would be most comfortable with. And look around after each choice as well to notice the differences. Multiple choices are okay here, so you can stand up for more than one response per question if you're able. Okay, I'm going to move on to my first question. And you can kind of read along here on the screen. You are about to give directions to a person who's standing with you. She's staying in a hotel nearby and wants to visit your house later. She has a rental car. Would you first draw a map on paper? So those of you who would do this response, if you could stand if you're able. Okay, so it looks like about a quarter of the room, thank you. The second option is to tell her directions. Okay, that's over half the room, great, thank you. Third, write down directions. Okay, about a third. And lastly, collect her from the hotel in a car, assuming we don't have snow like today. Okay, a small proportion of collectors. Okay, thanks. I have a second question. This might feel very familiar to you. You're about to learn a new program on a computer. You would first sit down at the computer and experiment. Who are the experimenters here? Okay, lots of people who would play around. Second, would you read the manual? I so admire the read the manual people. Okay, but it's a small minority, actually. To find someone to explain it to you is the third option. Okay, a good proportion, a third of the folks. And lastly, rely mostly on pictures and diagrams in a tutorial. Okay, great. Thanks. So in looking around the room, what struck me was the considerable amount of differences here, and I'm sure you'll notice that your students express preferences for different modes of learning. So this framework is really useful for thinking about the different ways that we process information, but the research on learning actually shows that individuals learn best if they're given opportunities to learn and process information through multiple modalities. This Onion article, which is entitled "Parents of Nasal Learners Demand Odor-Based Curriculum," kind of pokes fun at the idea that teaching modalities must match the preferences of our students in order for them to succeed. So for those of you that stood up for multiple responses, you were onto something. It's really multiple modalities that are important. Research in cognitive psychology suggests that using a variety, a combination, I should say, of spoken text, written text, visuals, and hands-on activities to reinforce learning is really the best way for students to learn. You can even tell your students that the research shows they'll learn better if they stretch beyond their own preferences to process information in all of these ways. So when teaching your students, avoid privileging your personal preference of styling, presenting information, and use multiple pathways, both verbal, written, visuals, and activities to communicate the material to your students. So I've highlighted several key student differences here, and obviously there are a lot more. You might be wondering, beyond some of the things I've highlighted in terms of the benefits of racial and ethnic diversity for learning, what are the practical implications of all of this for you as an instructor? So I've included some key take-home points if you flip over to the second side of your handout. The first point is that whatever you teach, you can't assume that students have the same learning preferences or that they bring the same experiences and backgrounds into the classroom as you do as an instructor or even as other students in the class do. And you'll recall this point about making assumptions about student backgrounds and preferences was expressed much more creatively by the CRLT players if you were here for the performance this morning. In many ways, this is actually what keeps teaching interesting. It's more of a challenge or an intellectual puzzle to figure out how to reach all of the students who are in your class each semester. Fundamentally, to reach all of the students, you need to ensure that the classroom environment invites all students to learn, cognizant of even how small actions can make people feel excluded or unwelcome. A second implication is that you'll want to make a conscious shift in perspective, less of a concern with yourself as a teacher or as a performer, and more of a concern with your ability to enable learning. You might have heard the term before, learner-centered teaching, and this is really a shift to that learner-centered perspective on teaching. Not how was my lecture or how was my talk going, but what did my students learn from it. To do this well means being clear about what you want your students to learn, and I know this was mentioned in our GSI panel earlier, really thinking about what are the learning goals and being purposeful about the pedagogical techniques that you use in class, rather than defaulting to a set of techniques because it's most comfortable for you. So for the remaining portion of this talk, I'd like to discuss several specific strategies that are particularly well suited for structuring your communication in the classroom so that you can enhance the learning of all students. You'll see that the last section of your handout has a section on each of these bullet points for you to take notes and follow along. So when I say communication, I mentioned this earlier, I mean communication in two senses, both from you to your students, but also how you provide opportunities for students to communicate their learning back to you. Some of what I'm about to highlight might seem obvious to you, and that's great. Just think of this as a reminder. These points really just give a fundamental framework to help you think about or remember what you already know makes for good classroom communication. So I'm going to focus the rest of the talk on these 4 subject areas, and I'll start with clarifying assumptions. Before you can effectively communicate with your students, you'll need to spend some time thinking about how you uncover both the assumptions you have and also the assumptions that students bring into the classroom. All of us bring assumptions into the classroom, assumptions that if not checked or dealt with can hinder the learning process. So how do you do this? One useful way to uncover some of your students' assumptions is to use some kind of background knowledge probe that is appropriate to your field. A simple question or an ungraded test or even an early assignment that gives you insight into where they're starting from. I'm going to give you a video example from Hans Rosling, who is a professor of global health in Sweden.
About 10 years ago, I took on the task to teach global development to Swedish undergraduate students. That was after having spent about 20 years together with African institutions studying hunger in Africa. So I was sort of expected to know a little about the world. And I started in our medical university, Karolinska Institute, an undergraduate course called Global Health. But when you get that opportunity, you get a little nervous. I thought these students coming to us actually have the highest grade you can get in Swedish college system, so I thought maybe they know everything I'm going to teach them about. So I did a pre-test when they came, and one of the questions from which I learned a lot was this one: which country has the highest child mortality of these 5 pairs? And I put them together so that in each pair of country, one has twice the child mortality of the other. And this means that it's much bigger the difference than the uncertainty of the data. I won't put you at a test here, but it's Turkey, which is highest there, Poland, Russia, Pakistan, and South Africa. And these were the results of the Swedish students. I did it so I got a confidence interval, which was pretty narrow, and I got happy, of course. I had 1.8 right answer out of 5 possible. And that means that there was a place for a professor of international health and for my course. But one late night, when I was compiling the report, I really realized my discovery. I have shown that Swedish top students know statistically significantly less about the world than the chimpanzees. Because the chimpanzee would score half right. If I gave them 2 bananas with Sri Lanka and Turkey, they would be right half of the cases. But the students are not there. The problem for me was not ignorance, it was preconceived ideas. I did also...
So this is a really important point, to think about the preconceived ideas that students might have about your subject area. So as you prepare for classes next week, think about how you might identify and deal with your students' preconceived notions about the subject that you'll be teaching. So what about, I've talked a little bit about students' assumptions, but what about your assumptions as an instructor? You as an instructor can interrogate yourself or create situations where others can interrogate you about the assumptions that underlie your approach in the classroom. Some ways to do this would be to have a peer to visit your class or a CRLT observer in your class, and I'll share a little bit more about this later. To provide meaningful time for students to ask questions or clarify issues, and to get peer feedback, so from other GSIs, on your course materials. One easy example of kind of interrogating your own assumptions is to look at the classroom policies section in your syllabus and think about what assumptions are reflected there. So here's an example. You can contrast these two with each other. The first policy might be that each student is eligible for 2 one-day extensions, no questions asked. The assumptions underlying this being maybe that adult life is complicated, things happen, it's important to be flexible. Another very common policy is that no late papers will be accepted without a documented excuse. The assumption underlying this being that meeting deadlines is a crucial skill to learn. Neither of these is absolutely right, and rather my point here is that it's important to examine your own policies and consider what values and assumptions underlie them. But also thinking about substantive assumptions that you might be making. What terminology might be jargon to students? What skills do they need to learn? For example, do they know what a peer-reviewed journal is, let alone how to find one? Do they know what plagiarism is, much less how to paraphrase an author's argument without plagiarizing it? So I'm going to move on now to the second bullet point about organizing material. Another way to check our assumptions is to use an organizational structure that will help us be certain that the way we're making connections is explicit to students. The student panelists this morning at our Experienced GSI panel talked a lot about the importance of organizing material, so this will be a little bit of a reminder of some of the good advice that they gave. In all of our conversations with students at CRLT, we repeatedly hear that students want structure. We know from the science of learning that you, as instructors who are experts, can help novices, your students, to develop meaningful knowledge structure through organizing the material. These organization strategies are listed on your handout that I'm about to share, but some simple ways to organize include first, regularly doing a recap of the previous class session, and either you can do that or you can have the students do that. As Claire mentioned, one of her keys to success, a second strategy is providing an outline of what you're going to cover and then returning to it at the end and reminding them of what's been done. Another strategy to signal when you're doing something that's particularly important, and there are various visual ways that you can do that, like dots shown here, but also underlining or bolding, or even using verbal cues like my first point or the author's key insight to help students follow the flow of the argument. This is crucial because students often have a hard time separating key points from interesting details since they're not often novices in your subject. So while it might be annoying to hear, is this going to be on the test? That question often signals that students aren't able to discern what's important from what's not. It's also important to take time to make sure that the connections are clear. Visual approaches can be really helpful in illustrating connections. In addition to really simple things like just drawing arrows here, I want to give you a couple examples of ways to make visual connections. One way that you or your students can do this is to create a concept map like this, which shows the links between topics. Concept maps can be used to give an overview of an individual class period, a unit, or even a whole course as a nice method, for example, of an exam review. Another visual way of structuring things for your students is a timeline. This is a timeline from PhD Comics that's on your handout that contrasts a graduate student's life plan with their life reality. As you can see on the timeline, you land an academic job at 28, whereas in reality, you choose a topic at age 28. But joking aside, this type of visual representation can be a helpful way of organizing material when chronology is important so that students can see how a set of topics, events, or even scientific discoveries relate to each other in time. Another valuable strategy is to provide a structured recap or a summary of especially non-linear course experiences. And an example of such an experience would be class discussion. A group discussion is inherently non-linear. Topics merge and diverge as the conversation flows. And while students appreciate interesting and lively discussion, we often hear from them that they don't know what to take away from those discussions. It feels really ephemeral to them. So it's important to save time for such a recap, to just review the main points of that discussion and how those main points fit in the overall course. Lastly, it's important to write down or hand out key terms for students. Research on note-taking tells us that students' ability to get specific terms and formulas written correctly is notoriously bad. And that's actually not surprising since note-taking is a complex experience of listening, writing, and summarizing all at the same time. This is why I've provided you with a handout on the student data and also some of my key takeaway points today. A great overview on the research on note-taking is available on CRLT's website. It's CRLT Occasional Paper 16. I'd strongly encourage you to take a look at it. It has a lot of really valuable strategies for helping you to promote good student note-taking. So I'm going to turn now to a third communication strategy, and that's engaging students. The research on learning shows us that those who are intrinsically motivated to learn are more likely to do so. Motivation matters for learning. You might think that motivation is fixed, but in fact, you can do some things to increase your students' motivation by engaging them with the course material. This necessitates considering ways that you can make the material relevant to your students, to their lives, to major issues of the day, to important human concerns or endeavors. A useful approach is to provide a wide variety of concrete examples of the phenomena that you're talking about, and you can either supply those or better yet, involve your students in supplying them. That accomplishes two things. It helps to broaden students' initial understanding of a phenomena, but it also increases their chances of connecting to you. A good example of this is the sociology instructor who asked students to identify an image, a video, or even a musical clip that illustrated the key point from each theoretical reading. Another approach is to build in opportunities for students to connect that material to their career or life goals. There's an environmental journalism class on campus where students who hope to go into the journalism profession participated in a pitch fest with local journalists. The students' most creative ideas were submitted to a National Foundation's competition for innovative environmental news ideas, and this really got the students motivated and they came up with some excellent ideas. Finally, no matter how skilled you are at these various strategies, that doesn't mean that learning has taken place. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about checking learning. On your handout, under the section on checking learning, there's a quote that really drives home this point by Angelo and Cross, who wrote an excellent book on assessing learning. Teaching without learning is just talking. And that's why it's important to check in with your students before test time to make sure that they're getting it and find out what they're still struggling with. There are a variety of ways that you can do this, and I'll go over 6 possibilities which are listed on your handout. First, many of us work at reading our audience, like I'm doing right now as I'm standing up here. I'm trying to look at your signals to see if you're getting it and seeing if people make eye contact, do they look bored or disconnected, and that can be useful, but it also is going to lose a lot if that's all that you rely on. Another strategy is to look for ways to connect with students as individuals. So Claire mentioned that this is a strategy that she does, but many GSIs survey their students about backgrounds and interests at the start of the semester to help them prepare to teach each unique set of individuals. So asking them questions about their backgrounds, their prior knowledge, or whatever's relevant for that particular class context. Another strategy is to encourage students to come to office hours, and one of our other GSI panelists, Tim, mentioned that he does this. Some GSIs require that all students make just one visit at the start of the term as a getting to know you strategy. Another simple thing to do is to show up just a little bit early, slightly before Michigan time, to chat with your students and find out how they're doing. Lastly, you can also collect their notes to see what they're finding is important. Obviously, you don't want to do this often, but perhaps once very early in the term, you can collect students' notes to see what they're getting and what they're writing down. Another way to do this is to have your class observed. And I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but we're observing a class of mine here. What you can do is invite an observer to your class to gather feedback from the students. So how might you do this? You can have a colleague, such as a graduate student mentor, if you have student mentors in your department, or you can have a trained CRLT consultant come and observe the students in your class and give you feedback from your students' perspective. 2 of our GSI panelists this morning are part of a team of graduate student consultants who work with GSIs across campus by visiting their classes and consulting with them about the student feedback. There's a link on your handout for those of you who are interested in learning more about how to request this service. Another way to check learning is just to use simple, quick activities called classroom assessment techniques. There's a great list of these on page 100 of your GSI guidebook, which is adapted from a book on the subject by Angelo and Cross. Some examples include things like minute papers or muddiest point papers. That's where you would ask students to identify their understanding of the main points of the day's lesson or to highlight areas where they were particularly confused. And the strategies don't need to be just written or verbal. As mentioned earlier, there's evidence that representing information in multiple formats, especially when one of them is visual, leads to better long-term retention. So one example from a chemistry class at U of M, one instructor asked students to find creative examples to explain the concept of equilibrium. Students do this using imagery, poetry, or even dance. And if this sounds a little too quirky to you, then you haven't heard of the Dance Your PhD competition, which is sponsored annually by Science Magazine. You could win a $1,000 prize. So these creative approaches might be non-traditional, particularly maybe in the STEM fields, but this instructor felt it enabled students to create their own understandings of the material and gave her an interesting way to assess whether students were learning what she was trying to teach. One final strategy is just being flexible. Be prepared to make changes as you see how things are going, and students will really appreciate that flexibility. So the information I've covered today should provide you with an overview of student diversity here at Michigan, as well as some strategies for communicating effectively with all of your students. And I hope that you'll see this diversity as a real asset for you in your classroom and a challenge that will make teaching more rewarding and intellectually stimulating part of your graduate education. For those who are looking for more resources beyond today's orientation, you could consider attending CRLT's seminar series, consulting the resources on CRLT's website, or coming in to see me or one of my colleagues. I'd like to end with a minute paper of my own. I'd like you to take 1 minute to write down 3 points from this talk or from an earlier session that you'd like to keep in mind for practice teaching, which is coming up next, and I'll share a little bit more about the logistical details of that. But first, I'll give you a minute to jot down some takeaway points. For those of you who are interested in linking to this presentation as a reminder later, the link is here and it's also on your handout. And thanks so much. Have an excellent semester and good luck in your practice teaching.